Bedrängung, Judevakuierung, die Ausrottung des jüdischen Volkes.
Oder die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa. Das Zeitalter eines überspitzten jüdischen Intellektualismus ist zu Ende.
On the 20th of January 1942, Reinhard Heydrich, head of the security police, summoned a meeting at an upmarket guest house on Berlin's Wannsee. Representatives of various ministries, high party and SS officials attended. Young, educated men, most of them with doctorates. Their topic, the Holocaust. The final solution of the Jewish question, as it was called in the language of the National Socialists. Heydrich's Judenreferent Adolf Eichmann took the minutes. 5 years later, American investigators found a copy of these minutes while preparing the trials of high-ranking Nazi administration officials. The Wannsee Conference suddenly became world famous as a symbol of the state-imposed mass murder of the Jewish people. The meeting at Wannsee continues to occupy historians like Peter Longerich to this day. Nowhere else is it so clear how the Holocaust was organized in Europe.
From a generally formulated intention to remove the Jews, to deport them, to leave them to their own fate, now becomes a very concrete program, a plan for the murder of the Jews, in that it was laid down how many people were to be affected, in what period of time, what number of people were to be deported, by what means they were to be killed.
A deceptive calm descended on Germany at the beginning of the 1930s. When the National Socialists came to power, the speed of the dictatorial Gleichschaltung, enforced conformity, surprised even those who had been warning against the Nazis for years. From the very beginning, anti-Semitism had been one of the central components of National Socialist ideology. In the mid-1920s, in his book Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler had propagated ideas aimed at the extermination of the Jews. After their seizure of power in 1933, the exclusion of Jews from all areas of society and life became the declared goal of Nazi policy. The first state-directed measure against the Jewish population was the boycott of Jewish businesses. After the harassment of doctors, lawyers, and merchants, the German student body staged the destruction of supposedly un-German writings.
Das Zeitalter eines überspitzten jüdischen Intellektualismus ist nun zu Ende. Und der Durchbruch der deutschen Revolution hat auf dem deutschen Weg wieder die Gasse freigemacht. Und der kommende deutsche Mensch wird nicht nur ein Mensch des Buches, sondern auch ein Mensch des Charakters sein.
Legal and administrative regulations followed. So-called Aryan paragraphs pushed Jews out of professions in the public service. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws were enacted, which regulated the relationship between Aryans and non-Aryans, and officially labeled Jews as people of inferior rights.
Nur der Staatsangehörige deutschen oder artverwandten Blutes, der durch sein Verhalten beweist, dass gewillt und geeignet ist, in Treue dem deutschen Volk und Reich zu dienen.
The Nuremberg laws formed the legal basis for the increasing exclusion, persecution, and eventual extermination of the Jews, the beginning of the final solution.
The concept of a final solution was actually at the center of the entire policy of the National Socialists. Behind it was the idea that the Jews were to blame for all the big problems of that time, and of course they wanted to have a total final solution. This consisted first of all of forcing the Jews to emigrate, then of deporting them to a reservation area, and finally the view that the final solution could only be achieved if the Jews were simply no longer there, that they were simply murdered.
At the beginning of 1938, new protective custody regulations were introduced. Persons hostile to the people and the state could now be arbitrarily arrested and locked up in concentration camps such as Dachau. As Munich's police chief at the time, Heinrich Himmler had already had the camp built there in 1933. A model for all later concentration camps, Himmler was determined to reorganize the system of camps, capable of expansion at any time, modern and up to date. Fueled by National Socialist propaganda, Austria celebrated the Anschluss to the Reich almost frenetically. Anti-democratic convictions were booming. Many wished for strong leadership. National Socialist anti-Semitism reached a new intensity. Newsreels commented succinctly.
In Wien, Juden flüchten.
In order to accelerate the expulsion of the Jews, the first Central Office for Jewish Emigration was established in Vienna under the direction of Adolf Eichmann. The client was Reinhard Heydrich, the later host of the Wannsee Conference in 1942. As head of the secret security and state police, he had established a tight system of control and repression. Heydrich and his powerful security apparatus were subordinate to the Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler and took a key role in the persecution and murder of European Jews. In November 1938, the assassination of the German diplomat Ernst von Rath in Paris provided the Nazi leadership with a welcome opportunity for massive attacks on Jews and Jewish property. 17-year-old Herschel Grinspan had shot the diplomat in retaliation for the expulsion of his Jewish parents to Poland. 2 days later, von Rath succumbed to his injuries. The indignation of the population over the alleged Jewish plot was directed and decreed from above. Jewish stores were looted, synagogues set on fire. Under the cover of the new protective custody regulations, a hunt for Jews began throughout the Reich. Tens of thousands were deported to concentration camps. Shaken by the organized terror measures, the largest emigration wave since the Nazis' seizure of power began. In total, around half of all German Jews left the country before the start of the Second World War. Escape became increasingly difficult. Due to expropriation and occupational bans, many Jewish families hardly had the means to pay for a trip abroad, and fewer countries were willing to take them in. Only a few weeks after the November pogroms, the threat of genocide was openly expressed for the first time. On the 30th of January 1939, Adolf Hitler addressed the Reichstag on the occasion of the anniversary of the seizure of power.
Ich will heute wieder ein Prophet sein. Wenn es dem internationalen Finanzjudentum in und außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Völker noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht die Bolschewisierung der Erde und damit der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
With this prediction, Hitler made the European Jews quasi-hostages should the Western powers oppose German expansion. With the invasion of Poland a few months later, the war for future living space in the East, long planned by the Nazi leadership, began. The German invasion was accompanied by excesses against the Polish population. The soldiers were followed by the special forces of the SS. They hunted down members of the Polish ruling class. The conquest also marked the beginning of a new radical phase in Nazi policy toward the Jews. More Jews lived in Poland, than anywhere else in Europe. Jews who were now at the mercy of German rule.
Der Feldzug in Polen hat uns Gelegenheit gegeben, das Judentum an seiner Niststätte kennenzulernen. Fast 4 Millionen Juden leben hier in Polen. Allerdings wird man sie unter der bäuerlichen Bevölkerung vergeblich suchen. Sie haben auch nicht unter den Wirren des Krieges zu leiden gehabt, wie die eingeborene polnische Bevölkerung.
There was still no open talk of extermination. However, the Jewish population had already been grouped together in as few places as possible in so-called Jewish reservations. The overseeing Nazi administrations received their instructions with reference to as yet undisclosed final destination. These photos, probably posed, give an impression of the orderliness of the occupiers. In fact, the new masters showed no mercy. The Jewish population was to make room for German resettlers, who, until then, had lived as minorities east of the Reich's border. Tens of thousands of Jews were to be deported to temporary camps and ghettos near the country's borders. There was a lack of transport, accommodation, and food. The occupying forces accepted that the displaced would not survive the hardships. Most of Poland now belonged to the German Reich. A residual area in the east became the Generalgouvernement, a so-called neighboring country with its own legislation and administration. One of the largest ghettos, initially, was created in Lodz, renamed Litzmannstadt. There, almost at the same time, ethnic Germans from the Baltic states, resettled in the new Reich territories, were expected to be Germanized. Because the German administrators were overwhelmed, the deportations of the Jews were temporarily halted. Repressive measures against the Jewish population, on the other hand, increased.
Das schwierigste Problem, vor das sich unsere Zivilverwaltung in den besetzten Gebieten gestellt sieht, ist die Judenfrage. Aus diesen Ghetto-Kaschemmen ist auf deutsche Soldaten geschossen worden. Die Strafe folgt dem Verbrechen auf dem Fuß. Dieses ostjüdische Untermenschentum hat seit jeher Westeuropa das internationale Verbrechergesindel geliefert. Von hier aus wurden die Demokratien mit Taschendieben, Zuhältern, Rauschgift- und Mädchenhändlern, internationalen Bankschiebern und Hetzjournalisten versorgt. Das sind dieselben Juden, deren Brüder, Söhne und Vettern in London und Paris für die Humanität und Zivilisation das große Wort führen.
A settlement of the Jewish problem by emigration had become impossible in the meantime, wrote the head of the State Security Office, Reinhard Heydrich, to the Reich Foreign Ministry in 1940. A territorial solution had to be found, a territory that could absorb the European Jews.
There were several variants of this territorial solution starting shortly after the beginning of the war. Firstly, to deport the Jews to a reservation in Poland. This failed. The second variant was the so-called Madagascar Plan in summer 1940, which was to deport 4 to 6 million Jews to the French colony. And then there was a third variant, which Heydrich came up with at the beginning of 1941. He got the order from Hitler to find a solution and came up with the proposal to deport the Jews to the soon-to-be-conquered Soviet Union.
Even though the situation of the Jews in Europe was deteriorating day by day, the Nazi regime was capable of even far crueler measures. Even before the Polish campaign, Reinhard Heydrich was entrusted with the expulsion of the Jews at the behest of Field Marshal Hermann Göring.
Since 1938 at the latest, Göring was the man who was generally responsible for the solution of the so-called Jewish question. At that time, it was mainly a matter of expropriation and the forced emigration of the Jews. For every further decisive step of the Jewish policy, he had to be consulted. He had to put his signature under authorizations and under general orders.
Heydrich's new plan to deport European Jews to Russia became within reach when the war against the Soviet Union actually began. On June 22, 1941, German troops crossed the Russian border. The former ally was unprepared. There was little resistance. The Wehrmacht units advanced rapidly. When Adolf Hitler visited the victorious troops at the front that summer, plans for a final solution of the Jewish question were already being worked on in the Nazi administration. A written order by Hitler was never found, but the implementation of the Führer's will in the orders of his subordinates was, like Göring's order to Heydrich of July 1941, with the task of preparing an overall draft for the implementation of the intended final solution of the Jewish question. In the Berlin ministries and Nazi organizations in the East, proposals for a final solution were being worked out on Heydrich's instructions. Meanwhile, implementation was taking place in the frontline areas. From the beginning, the war in Russia was waged with unprecedented brutality against the civilian population, especially against the Jews. The killing squads of the SS Einsatzgruppen did not shy away from murdering women and children. Their operational orders allowed them to execute radical elements, a vague term that allowed a lot of leeway on the ground. The casualty figures were less documented. The reports were distributed to the central offices of the Nazi government apparatus. There were many accomplices, and pity only for the perpetrators. One of the Einsatzgruppen leaders, Otto Ohlendorf, went on trial in Nuremberg in 1946. He described how he had wanted his men to avoid cruelty.
In referring to your previous testimony, will you explain to the tribunal why you believe that the type of execution ordered by you, namely military, was preferable to the shooting in the neck procedure adopted by the other Einsatzgroups?
Auf der einen Seite sollte damit erreicht werden, dass die einzelnen Führer und Männer auf militärische Weise durch Befehl die Hinrichtung vollziehen konnten und daher keinen eigenen Entschluss zu fassen brauchten, sondern lediglich auf Befehl, auch äußerlich handelten. Zum anderen war mir bekannt, dass bei den Einzelhinrichtungen durch seelische Erregungen sich Misshandlungen nicht vermeiden ließen, da die Opfer zu früh von ihrer Hinrichtung erfuhren und daher nervenmäßig einer längeren Belastung nicht standhielten.
The horrific climax of the first months of the war in the Soviet Union was the massacre of Babi Yar, near Kiev. Under the pretext of resettlement, more than 33,000 Jews were lured into a ravine and shot.
That was the one very decisive radicalization. The second decisive development was that Hitler decided quite spontaneously in September 41 to deport the Jews to the east. The original plan was to wait for the victory over the Soviet Union and then to deport the German Jews as part of a large European deportation solution.
The beginning of deportations from German cities was preceded by the introduction of the Jewish star and the ban on emigration. That Jewish neighbors were taken away was no secret. The deportations were bureaucratically regulated, took place in broad daylight, in public. There were assembly points and regulations about what they could take with them. Only the destinations of the primitive wagons were secret. From October 15, 1941, the trains rolled out of the German Reich into the already overcrowded ghettos of Lodz, Riga, or Minsk.
And this now triggered a chain reaction on the ground. That is, the German occupiers, SS civil administration, began to organize the mass murder of the local Jews, or planned even more extensive murder against the so-called Jews who were not able to work.
In search of effective methods for mass murder, the SS experimented with gas. There were euthanasia institutions to learn from. This murder technique was now adopted for the extermination of the Jews. In the conquered territories of Poland and the Soviet Union, mobile gas vans were used. A method not very popular with the German task forces, explained Einsatzgruppen Chief Ohlendorf in 1946 in Nuremberg.
Did you receive reports from those who were working on the van?
Ich habe Meldung dafür erhalten, dass die Einsatzkommandos die Wagen nur ungern benutzen.
Why not?
Weil die Beerdigung der Insassen für die Angehörigen der Einsatzkommandos eine starke Belastung war.
This stately building on Berlin's Wannsee became the new guest house of the Reich Security Police. With this purchase, Reinhard Heydrich beat propaganda minister Goebbels to the punch, a small demonstration of the power structure in the leadership circle. The Speaker of the House called for an interdepartmental vote concerning the Jewish question for the 20th day of January 1942. Meeting adjourned. Due to the counter-offensive of the Red Army outside Moscow and the entry of the U.S. into the war, the meeting was postponed for 6 weeks.
And we were at a very decisive point in January 1942. That is, the war had now become a world war. It would be fought longer than the Nazis originally imagined, and thus they were looking for a new, more radical solution to the Jewish question.
Representatives of the important Nazi ministries were invited, as well as the administrations of the occupied Eastern territories and high-ranking SS leaders. They all knew about the goals of the deportation trains and the fate that awaited the deportees. They were involved in the planning of the extermination camps and knew of the reports of the Einsatzgruppen concerning the mass murder of the Jewish population.
We know that these reports circulated in large numbers, for example in the Foreign Office, and there is a remark in the Wannsee minutes that is very apt, where one of the participants says that if the people concerned were faced with the choice of either being deported or being sterilized, they would of course prefer sterilization. So they knew very well that deportation was connected with a terrible fate, that death was connected with it.
Adolf Hitler had already made it clear in his inner circle of leadership that this was exactly what he had in mind. It would be good if the horror preceded us, that we exterminate Jewry, he said shortly after the deportations began. Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary after a reception with Hitler,
"With regard to the Jewish question, the Führer is determined to clear the air."
And Himmler noted,
"Jewish question, to exterminate as partisans."
In the spirit of the Führer, the murder machinery that had been started was increasingly expanded into systematic genocide. Heydrich's invitation to the Wannsee Conference, as it was later named, was another step in this direction. By referring to his legitimization by Göring, Heydrich positioned himself as a key figure in the implementation of the so-called final solution.
Heydrich actually wanted to bring to an end the process that had lasted throughout 1941, in which the various ministries were to reach agreement with the Reich Main Office on the framework conditions for the deportations. And this Conference of State Secretaries was supposed to be the final point.
In camouflaged language, the protocol stated, "Final solution now means, with the Führer's approval, evacuation to the east, and the measures are to affect some 11 million European Jews."
There were really 4 questions that had to be answered. How was this final solution to take place? Heydrich apparently still insisted to shoot the majority of the Jews or to exhaust them to death through forced labor.
The forced labor would lead to the natural diminution. The resistant remnant should be treated accordingly in order not to be the nucleus of a new Jewish construction.
The second question, when? Heydrich had planned to kill the Jews over a longer period of time. Post-war clearing up was to have included killing. Now it was a question of carrying out this mass murder while the war was still going on.
In the course of the practical implementation of the final solution, Europe would be combed from west to east. The start of the individual evacuation actions would depend on military developments.
The third question was where. Heydrich had foreseen the Soviet Union being conquered, but it had not been conquered, so he fell back on occupied Poland. And the fourth question was who. And here, questions remained unresolved. Questions about the half-breeds and whether to treat them like Jews or to exclude them from deportations.
This was a discussion held by no means out of compassion, but was about how to maintain an urgently needed workforce. The meeting lasted just under 90 minutes. No decisions were made, but there was agreement in principle. A success for host Heydrich, which he celebrated with Gestapo Chief Müller and Protocol Officer Eichmann. After his arrest in 1960, the court wanted to know more from Eichmann.
Können Sie mal erklären, warum nach der Konferenz ausgerechnet die drei Männer Heydrich, Müller und Eichmann zusammengeblieben und gefeiert haben?
Nur gefeiert.
Heydrich und Müller verstehe ich. Warum Eichmann?
Weil nicht das Protokoll, wir drei alleine gewesen und es war niemand mehr da. Da gab Heydrich bekannt, wie er das Protokoll aufgefasst zu wissen wünscht. Und nachdem er diese Punkte bekannt gegeben hatte, dann wurde von diesen Angelegenheiten nichts mehr besprochen, sondern ich wurde gebeten, ein Glas Cognac zu trinken oder zwei oder drei.
No unequivocal statement was to be released to the public.
The National Socialists had a very ambivalent attitude towards this subject. They once considered the final solution a state secret, so one could also be condemned if one revealed details in public. On the other hand, they made very clear in propaganda, Hitler's speeches, they sent out signals from which one could clearly see that the murder of the Jews was a fact, that it was going on.
Es ist eine kleine, wurzellose, internationale Clique, die die Völker gegeneinander hetzt.
And so it was that this protocol was stamped a secret Reich matter. Things weren't that secret, of course.
Eichmann later confirmed in court in Jerusalem that the participants had spoken clearly among themselves.
Gibt es hier im Protokoll einen Passus, da steht geschrieben, abschließend wurden die verschiedenen Arten der Lösungsmöglichkeiten besprochen. Entsinnen Sie sich daran?
Da sind die verschiedenen Tötungsmöglichkeiten besprochen.
Verschiedene Tötungsmöglichkeiten?
Jawohl. Nun ist mir diese Sache heute nicht mehr gegenwärtig, Herr Präsident, aber ich weiß, dass die Herren beisammen gestanden, beisammen gesessen sind und haben hier eben in sehr unverblümten Worten, nicht in den Worten, wie ich sie dann ins Protokoll geben musste, sondern in sehr unverblümten Worten die Sache genannt, wie sie eben, ohne sie zum Schreiben. Es wurde von Töten und Eliminieren und Vernichten gesprochen.
Reinhard Heydrich had resided in Prague Castle as Reich Protector for Bohemia and Moravia since September 1941. Under his command, arrests and executions were the order of the day. 3 months after the Wannsee Conference, Czech politicians in exile organized an assassination attempt on the hated SS man. A hand grenade hit his open car. Heydrich died of his injuries a few days later. The SS took terrible revenge. The village of Lidice near Prague was razed to the ground. This was where the assassins are said to have been hidden. The men of the village were shot, women and children deported to concentration camps. With Heydrich, Heinrich Himmler lost an important ally in Jewish policy, but also a competitor who had worked on his own draft for the final solution of the Jewish question on behalf of Göring.
I think that the death of Heydrich signified once again a radicalization of this process, which was already underway, because Himmler indeed had a free hand after Heydrich's death. Heydrich, after all, was still dependent on writing this draft in order to get Göring's approval. Himmler didn't need this approval because he could address Hitler directly. and so a possibly inhibiting element was eliminated here. And it is quite significant that Himmler took over the leadership of the Reich Security Main Office himself after Heydrich's death.
The SS chief personally took care of the expansion of the concentration and extermination camps in occupied Poland. Under the name Aktion Reinhardt, he ordered the systematic murder of Jews from the general government. Auschwitz was expanded to become the largest Nazi extermination camp. The name Auschwitz was to become a worldwide symbol of Nazi terror and genocide. By the end of the war, an estimated 1.5 million people had been murdered in Auschwitz. They died of gas, of hunger, and of disease. Nearly 90% of them were Jews. Under cruel conditions, the prisoners had to construct the buildings and facilities themselves. Trains with deportees rolled in from all parts of Europe. The killing factory was tightly organized. Even the transports claimed countless victims. Those who arrived were sorted at the unloading ramp into those who were able to work and those who were not. Those who could not work were immediately sent to the gas chambers. When the advancing Red Army reached Auschwitz in January 1945 and liberated the camp, all but 7,000 prisoners had been murdered or taken away on evacuation transports, the so-called death marches. In October 1943, Heinrich Himmler spoke at an executive conference of the party and SS in Posen. The speech is one of the most disturbing audio documents of Nazi barbarism. Never before had the Reichsführer SS spoken so openly about the murder of European Jews.
Ich will auch ein ganz schweres Kapitel, will ich hier vor Ihnen in aller Offenheit nennen. Es soll zwischen uns ausgesprochen sein und trotzdem werden wir nicht in der Öffentlichkeit nie darüber reden. Ich meine die Judenevakuierung, die Ausrottung des jüdischen Volkes. Es gehört zu den Dingen, die man leicht ausspricht. Das jüdische Volk wird ausgerottet. Das sagt Ihnen jede Parteigenosse. Ganz klar steht in unserem Programm drin, Ausschaltung der Juden, Ausrottung machen wir, Kleinigkeit. Von euch werden die meisten wissen, was es heißt, wenn 100 Leichen beisammen liegen. Wenn 500 da liegen oder wenn 1000 da liegen. Und dies durchgehalten zu haben und dabei, abgesehen von menschlichen Ausnahmeschwächen, anständig geblieben zu sein, hat uns hart gemacht und ist ein niemals genanntes und niemals zu nennendes Ruhmesblatt.
Two years later, no one spoke of glory anymore. The citizens of Weimar were taken to Buchenwald concentration camp, for a time the largest forced labor camp on German soil, on the orders of the U.S. military administration. The camp was just under 7 kilometers from the Thuringian University town of Weimar. People were made to see with their own eyes the horrors and atrocities perpetrated in their midst. Atrocities no one had wanted to know about. The deportations had been routed through the main streets. There were bus connections, prisoners worked in the city. Immediately after the liberations, disturbing documentary footage was taken and shown to the public. In other camps, too, the U.S. military administration ordered forced tours. Impressions that now evoke disgust, bewilderment, guilt, and shame. On the way to the so-called final solution of the Jewish question, more than 5.5 million Jews fell victim to the National Socialists through gassing, shooting, medical experiments, or deliberate starvation. Half of them died in the extermination camps alone. The search for explanations never stops. Among the few concrete possibilities of finding answers today are the minutes of the Wannsee Conference, which took place here on the 20th of January, 1942. The minutes belonged to the Undersecretary of State at the Foreign Ministry, Martin Luther.
There were 30 copies of the minutes, but only one copy was found. All other recipients are likely to have destroyed their copies. Only in this case, Luther was in a concentration camp at the time because he had mounted a putsch in the Foreign Office against Ribbentrop. And because of that, he had probably not been able to clean up his papers. And so this copy of the Wannsee Conference was found in the files of the German Foreign Office Department after 1945.
Wilhelmstrasse in Berlin was already a government district during the imperial era. Even in the era of the National Socialists, the most important ministries resided here, like the Foreign Office under Hitler's foreign minister, von Ribbentrop. After the war, the former showcase address lay in ruins. Ribbentrop, along with other leading Nazi celebrities, was tried in the main Nuremberg war crimes trial. In one of the last so-called succession trials, high-ranking administrative officials sat in the dock, including members of the Foreign Ministry, which had played a particularly large role in the criminal system of the Nazi regime. The main defendant was State Secretary Ernst von Weizsäcker, father of the future German president and Ribbentrop's deputy. His Undersecretary of State Luther had represented the Foreign Office at the Wannsee Conference. Although he was not the highest-ranking defendant, Weizsäcker was representative of the involvement of senior officials on trial.
How do you plead to this indictment? Guilty or not guilty?
Ich erkläre mich für nicht schuldig.
One of the prosecutors was the German-born Robert Kempner, who was dismissed from the civil service by the Nazis in 1933 and later fled to the United States. From his time in the Prussian Ministry of the Interior, he was well versed in the bureaucratic jungle of the German authorities. In an interview from the year 1980, he characterized the accused thus.
Without these people, many things would have gone wrong. They were just the technicians. They could have worked just as well under a democracy as under the pressure of a dictatorship, but they were necessary.
Von Weizsäcker was accused, above all, of collaboration in plans for the destruction of the rest of Czechoslovakia and of signing orders for the deportation of French Jews. In court, he claimed that he had wanted to prevent a major war.
Weizsäcker was undoubtedly one of the most interesting and a very problematic personality. When someone is in this high position and then dances, as it were, at two weddings, the wedding of the good people and on the other side the wedding of the devil, then it is difficult to make a judgment about this person. The bad thing about Weizsäcker, in my opinion, was that he didn't disclose to us from the very beginning this double role that he played, as he said. During the first interrogations in Nuremberg, for example, he declared, "You know, Mr. Kempner, the AA had nothing to do with Jewish affairs." When he was then shown some things, he said he was shocked.
The prosecutors discovered documents in the files of the Foreign Ministry that proved Ernst von Weizsäcker's complicity. He could not have refused, said von Weizsäcker, defending himself, without losing his office.
Defendant Ernst von Weizsäcker,
I think he would have fared much better and his reputation for posterity would have been better if he had said, "I signed so-and-so documents, my Undersecretary of State represented the office of which I was secretary at the Final Solution Conference in Wannsee on the 20th of January, 1942. Instead of that, he later defended himself with trifles. Whether the signature was so, or whether the signature was not his after all. He and his ministry had given Eichmann the green light as to whether Eichmann could also carry out the deportation of Jews in foreign countries.
die Judendeportation durchführen konnte.
For over 15 months, the U.S. military tribunal in Nuremberg was in session. The last sentences were handed down in 1949. Ernst von Weizsäcker was acquitted of the charge of preparing a war of aggression, but found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Nowhere had evidence been found, the verdict stated, that the defendant had tried to prevent the deportations. In search of evidence of the defendant's involvement, prosecutor Kempner had the records of the Foreign Ministry thoroughly searched. With success. Kempner's colleague Betty Nutte immediately recognized the explosive nature of the minutes she had found, 15 pages that lend special weight to the Wannsee Conference to this day.
The Wannsee Conference gives us the opportunity to look at this decision-making process as if through a window. The decision-making process that led to the development of a program of systematic murder of the Jews of Europe, from the persecution of the Jews in the fall of 1939 and the summer of 1942.
A process in which many participated for a wide variety of motives. Today, the minutes give everyone the opportunity to get their own impression of the systematic radicalization of Jewish policy.
The members of a government, secretaries of state, talked more or less openly about the murder of 11 million people. And that's something that makes it clear that the Holocaust is also different from other mass crimes, from other genocides, because there was a very clear element of planning, of intention, of taking responsibility at a high level.
None of those invited to the conference was held legally responsible for their participation. There was also no moral sense of guilt.
There was only one participant, the representative of the Reich Chancellery, Kritzinger, who said quite openly that he was not only there, but that he also knew what it was all about. And also in a certain way, in his statement, he expressed his regret. He had taken the position that he had to stay in his office as long as it was possible. And that is the only halfway open statement from the participants that we have.
The further fate of the participants of the Wannsee Conference. Alfred Mayer took his own life in May 1945. Georg Leibbrandt went unpunished. He died in Bonn in 1982. Wilhelm Stuckart served his sentence of internment. He died in 1949 in a car accident. Erich Neumann was released from prison in 1948. He died 3 years later. Roland Freisler was killed in an air raid on Berlin in February 1945. Joseph Bühler was sentenced to death in Krakow in 1948. Martin Luther, whose minutes had been preserved, was sent to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp because of an intrigue and died shortly after his liberation in May 1945. Gerhard Klopfer went unpunished. He worked as a lawyer until 1987. Wilhelm Kritzinger died in 1947 after release from internment. Otto Hoffmann was sentenced to 25 years in prison and then pardoned. He died in 1982. The fate of Gestapo chief Heinrich Müller is unclear. He was last seen in the Führer bunker and since then was considered missing. Adolf Eichmann, who had written the Wannsee Minutes, fled to Argentina, was arrested in 1960 and executed in Jerusalem. Eberhard Schöngarth was executed in 1946 for shooting a prisoner of war. Rudolf Lang committed in February 1945. Reinhard Heydrich, the host of the Wannsee Conference, died in 1942 after his assassination in Prague. The former guest house of the SS, in which the conference on the final solution to the so-called Jewish question had taken place, has, since 1992, been a memorial. Interest in the house and its history has continued unabated ever since.
It certainly has a lot to do with the minutes, which is one of the few documents that is so detailed. And it has to do with the fact that we have a place that you can actually visit, where you can actually connect these events, which are not easy to explain, with something concrete.
The Villa am Wannsee is closely linked to the history of the Holocaust. Even though we know today that the decision to bring about the so-called final solution to the Jewish question was not made here, what we do know from Wannsee is that it was a decision that was supported and implemented by many people, and that those who questioned it were far too few.